Good afternoon. My name is Stratos Efthimiou, and I'm the Consul General of Greece in Boston. The Consulate is glad to co-organize today's webinar with the college here in Athens. When we were planning this event with CYA's president, Alexis Philaktopoulos, more than 4 months ago, no one could have expected the developments in Ukraine and the ongoing illegal and unjustified war, which has caused pain, innocent casualties, destruction, and displacement of refugees. Who would have thought that Europe would go back to the First World War or to World War II in 2022, more than 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union? And for us, Greeks, a year when we remember the Asia Minor catastrophe of 1922, and we reflect on the events that led to the destruction of Smyrna, the violent expulsion of Greek refugees, and later the massive exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey following the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. A treaty that marked the end of the Ottoman Empire and shaped in many ways the emergence of modern Greece and Turkey. The Asia Minor destruction, as it has been imprinted in our national imaginary, is an issue that has been personally haunting for me since my childhood. I was brought up by my grandparents, who were first-generation refugees from Antalya and Ispartas, party of Pisidia, cities which they were forced to abandon in October 1922, 1 month after the destruction of Smyrna. My grandparents came as young refugees to Greece, and through hard work and night education, they managed to integrate themselves in the Greek social fabric. But they never forgot their culture, their recipes, traditions, songs, elements that they relate to the next generation. So it is always with a feeling of sorrow and nostalgia that I approach, as I believe most of us, the Asia Minor destruction of 1922. And I look forward to hearing Professor Kitroeff's systematic and breathtaking work on the tale of Cosmopolitan Smyrna and its destruction. I'm also grateful to Fotini Christia. Fotini also has origins from Asia Minor, and one year ago, together with our common friend Elpida Roka, we had the idea of organizing a series of lectures and activities on 1922. And I'm glad that we're doing this webinar together with CYA, whose founder, Smyrna Philaktopoulou, was herself a refugee from Smyrna. With these thoughts, I want to invite the president of CYA, Alexis Philaktopoulos, and thank him once again for his support and collaboration for the success of this joint event. Alexis, the floor is yours.
Welcome everybody to CYA's virtual lecture series. My name is Alexis Philaktopoulos and I'm the president of college here in Athens. I'm delighted that the Consulate General of Greece in Boston and CYA can co-host this event today. Before I get into presenting our speakers, the speaker and the discussant, I want to congratulate Stratos Efthimiou for the amazing work done at the Consulate General of Greece in Boston under his leadership. Stratos' service for Greece in Boston has been phenomenal. The Consulate General, under his direction, has opened new roads, and in spite of the challenges of the pandemic, has managed to foster closer ties with Americans of Greek descent who are academic or business people in the Boston area. It is a great importance to the Hellenic community as a whole to present today a lecture inspired by the centennial of the Smyrna catastrophe. The events of 1922 are significant in particular to CYA because its founder, Smyrna Philaktopoulou, my mother, was a refugee from Smyrna. At the age of 15, she was forced with her family to flee and seek refuge in Greece that was in mid-September 1922, in order to survive. As I was growing up, I heard stories about the beauty of Smyrna, its multicultural, multi-ethnic character. I have also listened to horrific stories, horrific accounts of what took place. I'm sure many of you today will have your own family accounts and stories as well of what transpired in Smyrna in 1922, 100 years ago. Our lecture today is also very timely, as the world is reliving the horror, a similar horror, with million-plus refugees living the destruction of their own land in the Ukraine. So let us dedicate this talk today to those who are suffering in Ukraine. Today our guest speaker is Alexander Kitroeff, Professor of History here at CYA, and our leading professor of CYA's Hellenic Executive Program, and a member of CYA's Academic Advisory Roundtable. And he will illuminate what Smyrna was like at the beginning of the 20th century, and will review the events that caused the Asia Minor disaster that led to the destruction of Smyrna. I don't want to spend time listing Alexander's accolades, since his bio is available in the electronic invitation that we have sent you. However, I do want to mention that Alexander has become the par excellence current historian of the Greeks in the United States. Aside from his academic research, which focuses on identity and the identity of the diaspora, he has also collaborated with film director Maria Iliou as a historical consultant in several documentary films. One is a captivating film about Smyrna in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, with previously unseen footage from archives in the United States and Europe. For those in Athens, a showing of the film, of this documentary, will be held this Saturday, 19th March, at the Megaron, the Athens Concert Hall, and perhaps some of you may want to see it. Facilitating today's lecture will be Fotini Christia. Fotini is the Ford International Professor in the Social Sciences in MIT's Department of Political Science. Her research includes issues of conflict and cooperation in the Muslim world, and she has conducted field research in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Iran, the Palestinian territories, Syria, and Yemen. She's a native of Greece. She grew up in Thessaloniki and moved to the United States to attend Columbia University. She graduated magna cum laude in 2001 with a joint BA in economics and operations research, and has an MA in international affairs. She joined MIT, the MIT faculty, in 2008 after receiving her PhD in public policy from Harvard University. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Fotini, for accepting our invitation today, and thank you, Stratos, for co-hosting this event tonight. It is a privilege to have both of you here today. Without further ado, Fotini, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Philaktopoulou, for this very generous introduction. It's really an honor to be here, and I salute this initiative. I want to thank you and Consulate General for organizing, and Professor Kitroeff for sharing his knowledge on the topic. And it's really a delight to be here with such a distinguished speaker and to travel with him on this virtual visit of early 20th century Smyrna, a cosmopolitan city of the likes of Alexandria, Salonika, Constantinople in the then Ottoman Empire, that developed and flourished as a trading route between the East and West. And though it served as a hub that really connected the two cultures, it also witnessed a monumental catastrophe, getting burned to the ground in 1922 with the rise of Kemalist Turkey. And with it, it brought down the end of the Greeks' great idea, as well as the end of the Greek presence in Asia Minor. As we will be commemorating the 100 years of the Asia Minor catastrophe this coming September, this seminar is intended to get us thinking of what a commemoration of such an event should look like. How do we pay tribute to the victims and all that was lost with them? How do we celebrate all of the accomplishments of the displaced that took root in Greece and actually really led to an incredible economic development of the areas where they settled, mostly in the north? And how do we remember and teach the history of what happened, as well as the realities that came from it in modern Greece? Before giving the floor to our guest speaker, I would like to go over some rules, housekeeping rules. Throughout the discussion, you can submit your questions using the chat box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will then be facilitating this Q&A after Professor Kitroeff concludes his presentation. And for those of you watching us via YouTube, please feel free to also submit questions in the comment section, and we will address those as well. Thank you again for being here. And Alexander, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, first of all, to the General Consulate in Boston and dear friend Stratos Efthimiou. Thank you to College here in Athens for inviting me to share my thoughts about the centenary of the destruction of Smyrna. I do recall it is almost to the day that we were discussing in the same context the bicentennial of the Greek Revolution. And now we are here in a different anniversary, a more difficult, a tragic moment for Hellenism, but one that requires the type of reflection, I think, that we had with the bicentennial. I think these anniversaries are an opportunity to look back at our history and try and draw the best lessons we can from the historical experience. So what I will be doing is I'll be sharing my screen in a minute and sharing a 10-slide PowerPoint which offers my own perspective on this anniversary. And here we go. Let me get it into slide mode and start with the first slide. This, which is the slide that is also on the poster that advertises the talk, is perhaps the most familiar image we have, both in print and in our minds, I think, when we look back and we think and we recall what happened in Smyrna in 1922. It is the burning, the destruction of the city, at which the Greek, Armenian, and European neighborhoods are burnt to the ground, destroyed, costing the lives of thousands of people, creating thousands of refugees, and bringing an end to a 3,000-year presence of the Greeks in the Asia Minor littoral. It's the end of the great idea for Greece. The event itself was, of course, preceded by the collapse of the Greek front, the Greek army, with the approval of the great powers, had landed in Smyrna in May 1919, and since then had pursued Turkish nationalists and irregulars who had attacked the Greek forces, had pursued them into the Turkish hinterland, where eventually their defeat meant their hasty retreat, which left the city open to the arrival of the Turkish armies, with the result with the result that we can see on our screen. How to commemorate this event, indeed? Well, there's not particularly one way. I think what we're going to see throughout This year will be many versions, many reflections, and I think the richer and the more variety of those reflections that we see, the more we will learn by the end of the year. My own particular view, my own particular perspective is that this event is, aside from the tragic destruction of the city, the loss of life, the creation of thousands of refugees, this event, looking beyond that smoke that we saw on that slide, is the end of a cosmopolitan city. And if I describe Smyrna as a cosmopolitan city, and we described Smyrna as a cosmopolitan city in the documentary I did with Maria Iliou, the question is raised, was it really a cosmopolitan city? Well, my answer is yes, it was a cosmopolitan city. It was also different types of cities as well. In some ways, it was an Ottoman city. It was an Ottoman city. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the administrative structure was Ottoman. The map here on the left shows us that the map of the city shows the quarters of the city. Ottoman cities were divided into quarters, neighborhoods writ large. The Turkish community, the Muslims were to the south in the uphill areas of the city. The Greek neighborhood was further up. In between the Greek and the Turkish Muslim neighborhoods were the Armenian neighborhood and the Jewish neighborhood, and the European neighborhood was closer to the seafront, the quay. So in many ways, it was an Ottoman city. It was also a Mediterranean port city, akin to Alexandria, Beirut, and Salonika, cities that were also cosmopolitan cities, but after World War I ceased to be cosmopolitan cities. Salonika became more of a Greek city. Alexandria eventually became more of an Egyptian city, and Beirut became less of a cosmopolitan city, became French, and then became, of course, Lebanese. These Mediterranean port cities were commercial centers, and that gave them that international character, that gave them the cosmopolitanism that I will be talking about in the next couple of slides. Undoubtedly, it was also a Greek city. It had depending on the numbers, and the numbers differ, and we'll have a quick look at the numbers, but the Greeks may have been, certainly were at some moments in the city's history prior to 1922, the biggest ethnic group. They had a rich community life, a rich cultural production, and in many ways, Smyrna was a center of Hellenism in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the city was all of those things. It was also a cosmopolitan city. The numbers game is always difficult, especially when we are talking about the Ottoman Empire, because we've got census figures coming from different sources. Ottoman sources done at different times, Ottoman sources that count different things, Greek sources, that would be the Greek consuls counting heads. We've got the Greek Orthodox Church coming up with its own statistics of Greek Orthodox worshippers. So it's very difficult to find any synergy between those numbers. They're always somewhat different. Most sources talk about the Greeks being the largest ethnic group in the early 20th century, not all of them. Henry Morgenthau, the US ambassador in the Ottoman Empire, believed that Smyrna's population was more than half Greek. The American consul in Smyrna at the time, George Horton, married to a Greek, in a sense, we can also describe him as a Philhellene, the way Henry Morgenthau was, wrote that before the fire there were 400,000 people, of which 165,000 were Turks, 150,000 were Greeks, and so on. Right at the bottom, this slide shows the Ottoman statistics. Now, the Ottomans didn't count the population in Smyrna itself. They counted in the Sanjak of Smyrna. That would be the administrative area around Smyrna. And they found 325,000 Muslims, 375,000 Greeks, and then Armenian and Jews as well. The numbers themselves, though, can't really be the one criterion that we decide whether a city is Greek or Ottoman or cosmopolitan. It's more than that. It's the functions of the city that are important. And of course, we have to acknowledge the Hellenic culture that I mentioned before. On the bottom left slide, you can see the Amalthea, a very, very important newspaper that closed down, of course, in 1922. Amalthea had a long, distinguished history of journalism and literary production. The top left slide is the Greek hospital in Smyrna. The ethnic groups of Smyrna had their own hospitals. There was a German hospital. There were hospitals of other European communities. And the top slide on the right, I think many of you will recognize, is the Evangeliki Scholi, the Greek school. Greek education in Smyrna at the time was on the same par as the education that was offered by schools in Alexandria and Athens, and there was no difference. There was a very high educational standard produced in Smyrna. So let us acknowledge the Greek character of Smyrna before we go on to the cosmopolitan character. What was Smyrna's raison d'etre? What did Smyrna do? Smyrna was the commercial entrepot, the city that connected the Ottoman Empire with the West. This is where the exports of raw materials from the Ottoman Empire, silk, cotton, leather, foodstuffs such as figs and olive oil, all those products left the Ottoman Empire and went to the markets of England, of France, and the other West European countries. What really Smyrna was all about was about commerce from the 18th century onwards, a maritime center, an export center of the Ottoman Empire, and also a place from which the Ottoman Empire imported finished goods from the European countries. International trade creates the needs for international education, not only Greek schools, in other words, but also international schools where many other ethnic groups studied. And these are two photographs of the American school located in the Paradise neighborhood of, Paradise was a neighborhood right outside Smyrna. Of course, now it's part of the expanded city. The presence of international schools is another indication of this international culture, of the fact that ethnic groups go to schools that not only belong to their own group, but to others because they're looking for proficiency in language or other skills. International trade also creates the need for interethnic socializing. It's not only that you're doing business with other people and getting to know them, that you also socialize with them because it's in the social centers of the cosmopolitan cities where everyone meets informally. And that, of course, is where the deals are struck. And the text in cursive that you can see is from the description of a traveler who is gone to Smyrna and is commenting on the socialization of the merchants. Let me just read the second paragraph. Merchants of all nations own meeting places called casinos they were called at the time, which were not necessarily gambling places, which at the same time can be considered as the Vauxhall of Izmir and the stock market. In this place, people would dance and transact their businesses, business, dancing, social meetings. This is the photograph on the left is the Sporting Club of Alexandria, and this is the European community that has come out on the terrace of the Sporting Club to welcome the arrival of the Greek fleet in May 1919. Levantines, the Europeans who were indigenous to the areas, Greeks, Armenians, French, and British, they're all on that terrace, mingling, having just maybe interacted, maybe have had their business deals, had that synergy that characterizes a cosmopolitan city. The cosmopolitan city has its cosmopolitan spaces as well. We know very well the international street in Smyrna was called the Rue des Francs, the Odos Frangon in Greek. It's the slide you can see on the left, and a crowded street full of shops belonging to different ethnicities, the commercial center of Smyrna in many ways that was one of the cosmopolitan spaces. The most famous, of course, was the seafront, the quai, as it's called, from its French name, because the French built the seafront of Smyrna in the mid to late 19th century. It's the typical thing that we see also in Salonika and Alexandria, where we have the corniche, a seafront with a string of establishments, hotels, bars, theaters, houses, which belong to the to everyone, to all of the European communities that exist in Smyrna. And if you went across the quai before 1922, just observing the signs, you would have been able to read signs in all the European languages that represented the citizens of Smyrna at the time. This is a map, location of the neighborhoods, a map of Smyrna that is very, very illustrative of what I'm talking about. On the south side of the map, the blue area is the Turkish neighborhood, the Muslim neighborhood. The one, the red area is the huge Greek neighborhood. It's actually shocking to pause and think that this entire part of the city was leveled and destroyed. The Armenian neighborhood is the brown in between the Muslim blue and the Turkish red. Odd coloring a little bit of this map, but it shows us the divisions, the quarters of the city that I mentioned. The Jewish neighborhood is in yellow. It's just tucked in just above the Muslim neighborhood. And what is important, I think, very much is the size of the trade zone and the so-called Frank neighborhood, which is this yellowish brown, which extends across the quai. Both the trade zone and the Frank neighborhood were basically the areas in which the cosmopolitanism of the city was expressed because of the mixed housing and the businesses which were operated by all the Europeans and including the Greeks. So if we kind of think of the city, this is my favorite slide of all, because it shows you the Ottoman quarters, and then we've got two quarters of the city, the trade zone and the Frank neighborhood, which underscore how cosmopolitan Smyrna was. And of course, that is the wealthiest part of the city. That's where all the economy of the city operated. 1922 for Smyrna was the end of cosmopolitanism. Coincidentally, I got a message from a reporter from a Greek newspaper yesterday asking me a very simple question. What was so special about Smyrna, and why do we think of it in that way? The question took me aback a little bit. I thought the answer was obvious. But if you think of it, Smyrna's got, and the destruction, the end of Smyrna, has very many common features with the other cosmopolitan centers in the Mediterranean that I mentioned. Alexandria, that we see on the top right. Constantinople, which itself was international and cosmopolitan until 1922-23. Thessaloniki, which is on the bottom left, which was cosmopolitan and eventually and very steadily became Greek after 1912, and very, very tragically lost its important Jewish community because of the Holocaust of World War II. So there is an element of destruction for Thessaloniki, but with Alexandria, the city wasn't destroyed. The Greeks were not kicked out. They were indirectly squeezed out by a series of measures. Constantinople, the Greeks remained after the exchange of populations. It was only Smyrna that was destroyed. So in many ways, Smyrna has got some common features with the other cosmopolitan cities, but it's special because its cosmopolitanism was destroyed in such a dramatic way. But despite the fact that Smyrna stands out, we remember it because of its destruction. I think if we think of Smyrna in the context of Alexandria, of Constantinople, of Thessaloniki, those four countries before World War I, then what we can remember is that those cities were multi-ethnic cities, multicultural cities, cosmopolitan cities in which the Greeks thrived. And the Greeks thrived not only because they collaborated and communicated and cooperated with each other, but precisely because they were able to forge alliances and to cooperate and collaborate with the other foreigners. And that, I think, for me, is what I want to remember from Smyrna and these other cities. If I look ahead towards, in a world in which nationalism becomes such a pernicious force, I want to remember the fact that the Greeks of Smyrna, along with the Greeks of the other cities, were able to exist in a multi-ethnic, multicultural world in which they thrived, in which they created wealth, in which they created their own cultural production, in which they interacted with other peoples. That, for me, I think, is the optimistic message, what I want to take as a lesson when I think of Smyrna. We had one person in the documentary, a descendant of the great Smyrna journalist Solomonidis. His great-granddaughter, Vanna Solomonidou, ended our documentary by saying, Smyrna is something special. You cannot leave it behind, you take it with you. And I really think, let's take that cosmopolitanism and all it meant and take it with us and not forget it, whilst, of course, we honor the memory of all those people who were tragically lost. Thank you. Here's a quick acknowledgement of my of my colleagues or from work I have benefited. There are many others, of course. These are just a few of the important works on Smyrna that I would recommend everyone consult. I will stop my share here, and Fotini will handle the question and answer session. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here and your attention.
Alexandre, thank you. This was quite the virtual trip to Smyrna of the early 20th century, and quite emotional too, I should say. I will use my prerogative as moderator to ask a couple of questions while I'm still organizing those we're getting from the audience. So first of all, I mean, as arguably, I think the most tragic case of the Asia Minor catastrophe was really the burning down of Smyrna, which, as you described, was precipitated by the end of the Ottoman Empire. And I wonder, I mean, as again, you highlighted, how we can think about this consolidation of the nation states in the former territories of the Ottoman Empire, and what that really meant both for cosmopolitanism and for kind of the Greeks, but also what it meant for the broader region. So my two questions are linked to that theme. First of all, I wonder if we can also think about what the displacement of all these Greeks meant for Greece. So the opportunity that they posed to bring in this richness, cultural richness, of this population in the newly won territories in the north. And I mean, it was a true demographic engineering, a triumph in a sense, that was enabled by these unprecedented catastrophes. So I wonder to what degree and how we should be thinking about the catastrophe, but also celebrating the triumph that was brought about by incorporating these people in the new Greek state. And Stathis Kalifas recently had a documentary series called Catastrophes and Triumphs, and one of the episodes really delved into this aspect of the human capital, cultural capital, and the perseverance of these refugees that literally even turned the marshes into arable land in places like Asprovalta outside Salonika, etc. So the second question, which is related but goes beyond Greece, looks at the broader region. And as you highlighted, it was not just Smyrna that lost this cosmopolitan identity. We saw Baghdad losing its Christians and Jews, Beirut, Damascus. And this lasted throughout the 20th century and even as recent as the conflicts of these past 20 years. So we see this complete uprooting of the Christians of the Middle East that have been there for thousands of years, and the Jews also, frankly, and what this has meant for development and stability in the broader region. And also thinking about this in this new stark light of divisions between East and West, I wondered if how kind of your broader take on this issue of the uprooting of these populations from the broader region. Thank you for considering these questions, and I'll be organizing the rest.
Thank you so much, Fotini. It's such a pleasure to, first of all, let me say, to have you as a discussant. Intimidating because your academic record is so impressive. I think I can answer those two questions, though, but I think they're nice, good, important issues to be addressed. So thank you for them. And well, going to the first question, yes, I mean, you used the word celebrate, and it's a huge irony. It's a huge irony what happens as we emerge from the Asia Minor disaster, as all those refugees come over to Greece. The eminent British historian Douglas Dakin has described this historical trajectory and its end in 1922 as the unification of Greece. It's a wonderful term. We talk about the unification of other countries. Italy and Germany had principalities, and they unified in the 19th century and became one country, acquired their borders, and that was it. And for Greece, the end of the great idea, whatever the result, was an important moment because Greece had been oriented from 1821 onwards, pursuing the incorporation of adjacent lands, lands that were adjacent to its borders, which had Greek populations, which were historically considered Greek, and Greece was focused in incorporating those lands. And in some ways, the country could not develop until that process had ended. When that process ended with 1922, and the Greeks from that adjacent area could not stay where they were and came in to Greece, and the Muslim populations were exchanged outwards, that gave Greece an ethnic homogeneity. But more importantly of all, I think the know-how that the refugees brought to Greece was really quite extraordinary. Greece really develops, it's catapulted forward economically with the contributions of the thousands of refugees, with all the know-how they bring from carpets to manufacturing to food to many, many other ways. The contributions are manifold. I think, as you did and as Stratos did, all Greeks who have Asia Minor backgrounds mentioned them. My particular ones are from Chios and Kefalonia, but in a sense, I think all Greece now there's been a fusion. We are all Mikrasiates in some ways, because the Asia Minor refugees have offered and given so much to Greece. So Greece was really strengthened by the Asia Minor disaster. What happened in Eastern Europe, I think, was a big reckoning. Looking at it in macro-historical terms, it was the end of the multi-ethnic empires, not only in Eastern Europe. It was the Austro-Hungarian Empire that collapsed. It was the Russian Empire that collapsed. It was the Ottoman Empire that collapsed. And out of the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't only modern Turkey that emerged, but the Arab countries also acquired their independence at that particular moment. So, unfortunately, I think it's the era of the nation states emerging in the Eastern Mediterranean. And unfortunately for the minority ethnic groups who were caught on the wrong side of the borders, this was an example of history going the wrong way for those particular people. But we should acknowledge that the emergence of nations, the collapse of empires was liberating, empowering, enabling for many, many people, at least for the majority ethnic groups who acquired their own nations and went forward from there. So a moment of collapse of multi-ethnic empires, a huge turning point in history with beneficiaries and victims.
Thank you, Alexandra, for this very thoughtful response. I want to get us started with a couple of questions from the audience. One question, two different questions, but I'm going to combine them in one because they raise a related theme, is how should we think about Smyrna as a cosmopolitan city as it connects to what Alexandria was at its respective time? How could we think of parallels between cities like that? And then more relevant to what's unfolding now in Russia and Ukraine, thinking about Odessa as a cosmopolitan city. So if you can take this question first.
Yes, well, and as some, I think, of the people asking questions know, I know more about Alexandria than Smyrna. And in fact, when I was invited to work on the documentary, I was slightly hesitant. And then after spending time reading about Smyrna, I realized that the huge similarities between the two countries. The two cities. and the two countries in some ways. Both Smyrna and Alexandria, port cities in the Eastern Mediterranean, exactly the same functions, what I spoke about. Raw materials leaving the country, the European powers relying on, I'm talking about the European powers, Britain and France, relying on their own Europeans and especially the Greeks as middlemen minority. And the Greeks themselves, being in Smyrna, being in Alexandria, not being in their own country, but being in an international environment, forging these alliances, adapting, finding ways of functioning in conjunction with the other international communities. For me, both Alexandria and Smyrna are examples of cosmopolitan cities with an important Greek presence. And so was Odessa, which, of course, Odessa loses that characteristic. Earlier on, the two major ethnic groups in Odessa were the Jewish community and the Greek community as well. And to a great extent, Odessa is also part of those cosmopolitan cities. I could have very well have included Odessa in my 4 slides. I think it's a good point, and thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Alexandre. Another question that is similar in the sense of thinking about the broader legacy of cosmopolitanism. One of our participants had his mother born in Smyrna, and he's Sephardic Jewish and lives in New York City. So he wanted to get a better sense of what the Jewish quarter was during that time of cosmopolitanism in Smyrna. So if we can travel him through that a little bit more. And I mean, it was clear that there was a Christian quarter, an Armenian, and Jewish, a Muslim. So what was life like in the Jewish quarter?
So when the Jews were expelled from Spain and settled in the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan directed the Jewish communities to 2 or 3 places. Importantly, obviously Salonika and also Edirne, Adrianople. So those were the 2 main Jewish centers. Which meant that the Jewish presence in Smyrna was not had decided not to be very big, so the Jewish community was quite small in Smyrna compared with the other Jewish centers in the Eastern Mediterranean. And most of the travelers' accounts that we have, and I've read a lot of those travelers' accounts, describe the Jewish neighborhood as not one of the wealthiest in Smyrna. The poorest was the Muslim community, quite clearly. The Jewish community is sometimes described as a little bit like the Armenian one. It's got some poor sections. There's a small segment of the Jews of Smyrna who are wealthy and are wealthy merchants and doctors. Interestingly enough, Smyrna has both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews as well, and their reaction to the arrival of the impending arrival of the Turkish army is very interesting, because the Ashkenazi Jews have one look at the situation and think, here we go, there's another pogrom on the way, because we've experienced those things in Eastern Europe. And they move, a lot of the Ashkenazi Jews move over to Rhodes and Kos, and then further away. So some of the Sephardic Jews will stay because they've got they're more integrated into Ottoman society. But of course, those Sephardic Jews that will stay in Smyrna after 1922 will suffer from the Vergeli tax, I'm not pronouncing it very well, of 1942 that hit all the non-Muslim communities. So that was a final blow to the Sephardic presence in Smyrna.
Yeah, fascinating, and fascinating to hear that there was both Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in Smyrna. I mean, further highlights the cosmopolitanist aspects of the city. Another one of our participants wants to know how we communicate this legacy of cosmopolitanism to our youth. How this kind of historic cosmopolitanism, how does it translate as a legacy to, you know, our young people now? How can we get them excited and interested in this? And also, I guess, thinking about the how to interpret what was happening then in the light of today.
So I have an instinctive answer, and then I'm going to pull it back because it's too. I'm going to say we should immediately make the connection with, let's say, New York, this wonderful. It's not surprising that someone who was living in Smyrna, their ancestors were in Smyrna, is living in New York. However, I mean, there are differences. There's a concept now in the international, in the kind of academe, that talks about global cities, and there's a kind of definition of what a global city is, and a global city is an international economic center which has connections to the rest of the world, hence it becomes global. So my instinctive reaction is to say, oh, well, yes, this is those cities are were the New Yorks of before World War I. But I think after we and especially if we're talking about young people, we need that type of way of grabbing their attention. But then we've got to kind of get a little bit more particular and draw the differences. But my instinctive thing is New York, and then say, look, okay, but it's a bit different, and then explain that.
I like the comparison, and I think it will definitely resonate. So some of our other speakers, participants, I mean, are interested in understanding what, if anything, remains in Smyrna that could relate to this era and that could be seen as Greek. And so what would it be like to visit Smyrna today? And also a related question, could we ever see, what would it take to see Greeks again in these places in Asia Minor, if that would be possible?
The second part is actually easier and more surprising. The answer is more surprising, but what do we see now? I was very fortunate. My first visit was a very brief one. I took a day trip from Chios. I went over to Chesme, and then we had a day trip. And our guide was a Turkish. He was a Greek Muslim. He had grown up in Kos and was a Muslim, and then had gone to Smyrna and Izmir and studied, and then became a tourist guide. So because of his Greek background, the island, of course, I mean, so because of his knowledge of Greek as well, he was a wonderful guide, because the bus took us through the very few parts of the city. There's very, very little left. I mean, the whole of the care was destroyed. There's very little left. But he took us to one or two places. He took us to the one or two buildings that were standing. And then the most moving thing of all, he took us to where that big Greek neighborhood was, and explained that the Greeks started referring to it as ta kamena, the burnt. And that's where there is, it's a little bit like where the Thessaloniki International Exhibition is. It's an big open space where exhibitions are held, and that's where a lot of the Greek buildings were. So there's not much in those terms. There is, of course, the topography. You can go there. You can go on the seafront. You can look across at Cordelio and the other places and get a kind of sense. The quay itself has been, there's an extension to it. They've built there 2-3 meters of extra concrete on the quay. So it's kind of wider, and you don't get the what must have been a horribly claustrophobic sense when the refugees were massed there and their lives were under threat and they were trying to escape. So the K is more open, but I think still, I mean, what I did was the first thing I did was when we got off the bus was to go on the seafront and just spend a moment of reflection. So I think you need to read up on things and be prepared to try and find things. It's definitely, as I implied in the talk, it's not like in Alexandria where you can actually go and see everything. So you've got to use your imagination and your kind of have a sense of try to sense things as well. Greeks are doing business in Turkey and in Smyrna, and I think I can share this story. I was speaking to the president of the Holy Cross Hellenic College, the president of that institution in Brookline, Massachusetts, and he's a businessman, and he was doing business in Izmir, and he was one of the early Greek businessmen, and he was a bit reticent about telling them he was Greek, so he kind of fudged what he was, and everything was going well until they took him to the fish market, and he saw red mullets and went, "Oh, Barbunya," and all the Turks around him laughed and said, "We knew you were Greek." But his experiences are very positive because it's this, if we get away from the politics, the people to people contacts, and, it works. So there are Greek businessmen in Izmir, so I think there's hope, and I think these are things I know, and this is why I think when I think about the legacy, it's not romantic. I think there's a real people-to-people dynamic there.
And as a last question, building off of this people-to-people dynamic, thinking about where most of these people ended up in terms of the displaced. So we know the bulk of refugees ended up in Greece and in the northern part of Greece. But where else can we find the refugees of Smyrna? And also in terms of the Armenians that left, the Levantine families that left. You made reference to the Jews that left and how we could see some of these families initially in Rhodes and then further out. So some reflection on that and just getting a sense of where all these cosmopolitan descendants could be found now, other than New York.
Other than New York, I think they're in. I think there are some Mikrasiates in the New Haven, and I think there are people from Alatsata around the Boston area. So
in Somerville.
In Somerville, yes. So I think they've gone. I think they have gravitated. And that takes us back to the Smyrna, New York connection. They have gravitated to places where the legacy of cosmopolitanism and multi-ethnicity can be lived again in many ways. But the United States is one of the main areas. There were people who went down to Alexandria who were very well received by the Greeks in Egypt. And whoever was wealthy enough, of course, got relocated in the big European cities. So, in a sense, there is a Smyrna and Asia Minor diaspora across the world.
There are some fabulous questions that unfortunately we cannot take at the moment because of time considerations, but they do speak to issues of. Now we see these refugees for the real wealth they brought to us, but how were they received initially? And I think this makes us reflect exactly on refugee flows that we've recently experienced, and this whole idea of what it takes for these folks to integrate and how they're received in the respective host communities. But I would like to thank Alexandros again for this really terrific conversation presentation, a link to the beautiful documentary. Another participant asked where they could see it if they don't live in Greece. And we will try to show it, have a showing in the fall, early fall, around September in the US as well. And we will be in touch to communicate that. And now I would like to pass the baton back to Stratos for kind of a goodbye and his closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Fotini, for coordinating this discussion in such an eloquent way. Our thoughts are, of course, in Mariupol, in Odessa, and in Ukraine, with the hope that the war ends immediately and that the spirit of tolerance and interethnic coexistence will prevail. I want to thank Professor Kitroeff for his vivid presentation that gave precious context to our diaspora and our English-speaking friends. Alexander's historical research and academic work are invaluable, and I'm glad that we managed to shed light on his research and work on Smyrna. We are, of course, grateful for the hospitality of College here in Athens and its president, Alexis Philaktopoulos. So thank you all for joining us today and for your attention. Thank you.